A very good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for making it to this session today. And would like to also greet those who are joining us online, and we hope they are all sorted, they can hear and hopefully see us. I would like to start this session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. About the session today, we know that the PMTCT program has contributed to a dramatic decrease in HIV transmission to infants. And the UNAIDS report notes the progress that has been made through a framework of the global plan to eliminate new infections amongst children. And this report tells us that between 2010 and 2015, we have seen a coverage of PMTCT from 45% in 2010 to 85% in 2020. And this has resulted in 53% coverage, 53% reduction during the same period. However, with all of that, I'm sure we all can tell and agree that that is not enough, because about 160,000 HIV infections in 2021 occurred in infants and young children. And with these small children fall between the cracks in the prevention cascade, and particularly during a very critical time of mothers, which is breastfeeding. And I think we are all here today because we agree that this is not acceptable, especially in 2023. And a lot more still needs to be done, and a lot more approaches are needed to try and address this. So today's session is really looking at that, as you can tell, which has brought you here, that we are here because of the promise that the broadly neutralizing antibodies are offering us. So I think, and in fact we believe, and we'll be sharing also the outcomes of a meeting that we had that was organized or convened by IAVI, the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation, and Advocates for Prevention of HIV in Africa in Cape Town. This meeting happened in February. And in that, we really looked at the fact that with the bnAbs, we have a breakthrough. And I think we all know what it is. And in fact, we'll be hearing more what it is that the bnAbs are offering us. And this is really seen as a revolution that is right in our hands in order to be able to help us and address this. There's evidence that the bnAbs are safe and that they are going to work. And in fact, they are long-acting. With just a few shots over a period of breastfeeding can potentially prevent babies from having to grapple with a life of HIV. It can also be done. It can be affordable, and I know that Glenda is also going to tell us that they can be affordable. And in fact, they are in a way respectful in a sense that they are non-stigmatizing and in a way that they are delivered. And there's a lot more, and I think we need to acknowledge that there's still a lot more to figure out in terms of how they are delivered. However, we are here today to acknowledge that this is a problem, but a problem that we can solve. In fact, a problem that we must solve by using the strategies and in fact, because all of these infections are, well, not all of them, but largely these infections are happening in the sub-Saharan Africa region. And therefore, the solutions that are looking to address this should be coming from that region. So with this vision in mind, the organizations that have convened these sessions, as a follow-up from a session that we had in Cape Town, we are looking to explore and look at what it is that has been, what it is that we have and what evidence do we have, but what it is most importantly that can be done and how that can be done. So without any further ado, I'm going to start introducing our speakers for the session. And the very first speaker that we have, I have a lot of papers in front of me. But we are having somebody who is going to be sharing experiences as a community person who is involved in a lot of work that's working largely with women and communities, Her name is Enele Mantombazane Zulu. Enele has experience on working with abused women, offering support of effective referral on their needs and well-being. And the programs that she is implementing are on integration of gender-based violence prevention to HIV towards identifying the need to advocate the capacity of civil society and communities to reduce the spread of HIV and the impact AIDS has through a collaborative programming and which includes health behavioral change interventions and reaching women and girls, men and boys, and minority groups. She has passion in this work and in all of the work that is about communities. Enele is also a community working group member from a site of the South African Medical Research Council in KwaZulu-Natal in Durban at the Chatsworth site. So we would like to welcome you, Enele, to address us this morning. And please, let's welcome Enele.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to greet each and every one of you, also observing protocol. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we are meeting. So my name is Enele, as I've been introduced. I work for the Masipepe Network. It's translated as Let Us Be Safe from Gender-Based Violence incidents, where we are working with women, but also we have integrated the program to include HIV prevention, where we are also doing response and prevention. So my presentation today will be actually talking from the mother's perspective and also throughout the interventions that are in place to mitigate and prevent HIV, especially on vertical transmission of infants, what is in place, and what are the challenges, how can we bridge also those challenges. So just to give you a bit of a background, as I've indicated, I work mostly with young women, young girls, adolescents, men and boys. I also work with, our program is actually around healthy behaviors and also ensuring that we are also inclusive of the minority groups. Unfortunately, the prevalence of HIV in South Africa is still high. It's due to biological and behavioral factors. The community that I also represent is that of a mixed society where we work with rural communities and also urban settings. As you would understand, with the rural settings, we have leadership, authority leadership, where sometimes we see and where women, there's a lot of inequality among women. There's also cases where women cannot make informed decision with regards to their sexual reproductive health rights. And as a mother, I also represent a community which is contributing to global efforts to halt vertical transmission. So unfortunately, South Africa is still amongst one of the countries which has high prevalence of HIV. As you would see the indications of the stats, recently, 2021-2022, the South African statistics revealed that 1,300 women and young girls are infected weekly in KwaZulu-Natal. So above this challenge, there's also a challenge where we see an increase in teenage pregnancies. With regards to the interventions that are already in place, access to health services, there is efforts that are being done at community level where we are preventing vertical transmission of infants. The first one is access to health facility, HIV testing and counseling from pregnant women, which is a mandatory or prerequisite. So there's a high coverage of antenatal care support for pregnant women, where we are working with key populations and obviously with young girls and women. They are tested as soon as they consult the health facility. In cases where their HIV status is positive, they are immediately initiated in antiviral care treatment. As I've indicated earlier, we do, as we are implementing in rural settings, where we see that there are challenges for the community to access the services. We do have mobile clinics available to community where they are able to access these services. We also work closely with community health workers where they are accelerating information and knowledge to these beneficiaries. HIV positive people are also referred to nearby clinic or health facilities. So with regards to the response, yes, there are efforts that are done at community level, national level, global level, as you've seen some of the previous presenters. But also we feel that we really need to bridge the gaps. Yes, we do have antiviral care that is available. In South Africa, it is free. I believe that in other countries also it is free. We do have PrEP for HIV negative beneficiaries, but there are still challenges with regards to, people initiating through these programs. So I believe that there is an urgent focus on interventions to reduce or eliminate vertical HIV transmission. We also have structural interventions on behavioral change to curb the spread and new infections. So on my left, I think it's on your right, where it's projected, we have the Stepping Stones manual. It is a participatory manual which engages people at community level, where we are talking about healthy behaviors, we are talking about HIV, we are also giving pathways to health services. This has also been one of the evidence that have proven to work, where we are demystifying stigmas and social norms and harmful behavioral change, where we've seen cases where HIV people have been discriminated. There is still a need for community-based integrated service providers interventions for vertical transmission. We also need to ensure that we are doing continuous, consistent education of young girls, of women in the prevention of vertical transmission, whether it's through clinical trials, whether it's through biomedical interventions, and also integrating with behavioral change interventions. We also need to have continuous support of women throughout the duration of breastfeeding process. Yes, for HIV positive women, there is intervention that is provided, but our focus also needs to ensure that we are also including and focusing on women that are breastfeeding but who are HIV negative, but who seem to have a vulnerability and exposure to HIV. As I am passionate with the work that I'm doing, I feel like we need to influence on policy decision makers, where we are saying that no child deserves to be born with HIV in 2023 and in the upcoming years. So in conclusion, in as much as there are various work scientifically that have been done, medically, developmentally done, which bring us together, there are still gaps that needs to be bridged as the revolving of vertical transmission prevention expands. So I believe also through the work that we are doing, engaging with the communities, integrating the work that we are doing, we also need to adopt the ecological framework, where we are focusing on people on the individual level, where we are supporting them accessing health services, but also how do we also support them throughout the relationships that they are in, through families, how we help them, disclose their HIV statuses, how do we demystify it at community level where there are social norms, where HIV is still not accepted, where people are not accessing, the Western medication or accessing healthcare services. But we also need to ensure that our institutions are user-friendly, they are accommodative, and ensure that information and knowledge is shared equally and integrated with the community. And in closing, I'd like to end my session and thank you for being part of this session, and acknowledging the South African Medical Research Unit for giving me this opportunity to be here, and also the organizers of the International AIDS Society for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anneli, for that opening, which I think highlights the context in which all of this consideration of this intervention should be mindful of, and especially in terms of the support for women, and actually knowing that there are a lot of other structural issues that we should, in fact, this kind of intervention should really be developed within, or at least the frameworks that need to be considered in ensuring that, women are adopting the interventions, but most importantly, that they are supported as part of the programs. I will, and I hope that we all are taking, noting the questions, because we're going to have a panel discussion afterwards, and then we have an open session where we're all going to be sharing. But we are now going to move further and introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is Betsy McFarlane, who is a pediatric infection disease professor and section chief at the University of Colorado, and focuses her work on pediatric and perinatal HIV infections. She develops research on immune-based for prevention and treatment of HIV for the National Institute of Health International Maternal Pediatric AIDS Clinical Trials Group. In short, that is known as IMPACT. Betsy will be sharing with us the gaps in the perinatal prevention cascade, as well as the preclinical and health economics evidence on the potential role of passive immunization with bnAbs in preventing vertical transmission. And Betsy is joining us online, and there we go. Welcome, Betsy.
Hello, it's great I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'm also very excited that this session is carrying forward the work that was done at the consultation in Cape Town earlier this year. And I will be telling you a little bit about the evidence for the use of bnAbs for infant postnatal prophylaxis. I have no financial disclosures. So as Anneli just very eloquently spoke, we are failing the world's children. In 2021, there was an estimated 160,000 children that acquired HIV, and the most recent numbers in 2022, 130,000 children with newly acquired HIV. And for children that have HIV, they can suffer very serious consequences. Only 52% are receiving antiretroviral treatment. And children with HIV suffer 15% of the deaths versus only representing 4% of those living with HIV. So this is not to say that we haven't made excellent progress, and this was noted earlier in our session, that there have been major declines in the rates of HIV transmission from perinatal sources. And in this plot, you can see what the infections would be without antiretroviral treatment in the orange versus what the numbers have been in the blue bars. But unfortunately, these declines have now plateaued. And we are reaching about 80% of women living with HIV who are pregnant with prevention services, but that number of 80% has not increased since 2014. And currently, approximately 12% of infants that are exposed to HIV will acquire it. That's 1 in 8. And so we are vastly missing the WHO target for elimination of less than 5%. So what are the gaps in access to perinatal prevention that are resulting in these ongoing transmissions? So this stacked bar plot shows what some of those gaps were in cases of transmission. And a couple of the salient points I'd like to point out are that the breastfeeding transmissions represent about 50% of all the transmissions. About 22% of the new transmissions were due to incident HIV. So these are women who acquired HIV while they were pregnant or breastfeeding, either because they weren't able to access PrEP or perhaps didn't even know that they were at risk of acquiring HIV. And then 70% of the transmissions were associated with either not being treated or stopping ART. So our current regimens for prevention of perinatal HIV rely on oral daily medications. And as all of us know, this poses a challenge, and it's simply not always possible or feasible to take medications every single day. There are many reasons why adherence is less than optimal in this setting. There are some new therapies coming that we hope will be available soon that are long-acting small molecule injectables agents, such as long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine, that may bridge some of those gaps. So these may provide long-acting treatment for mothers, which will have less reliance on daily adherence, as well as potentially for PrEP for women that are pregnant and breastfeeding who are not living with HIV. But it would be great to have a universal, safe PrEP that can be an intervention for infants. And this is where the concept of passive immunization with antibodies, and specifically broadly neutralizing antibodies for HIV, comes in. There are several examples of very successful passive immunization where antibodies have been used for the prevention of perinatal and infant infections. These include hepatitis B and RSV. In the case of hepatitis B, HBIG, which is an antibody given once at birth, and plus vaccine will provide very durable protection. And a model like this would be terrific for preventing HIV as well. And RSV is also a virus that is acquired during early infancy and can be prevented with monthly injections of antibody against RSV. And now there's a new agent that's coming along that has long-acting and may provide coverage for as much as 5 months, allowing for a single injection to cover the full season. So what's the evidence for passive immunization for HIV using broadly neutralizing monoclonal antibodies? There are numerous preclinical studies using non-human primates to demonstrate the potential efficacy of bnAbs for prevention. And these have included intravenous inoculation as well as rectal and vaginal inoculation. But perhaps more relevant are the studies of an infant model of NHP, where an oral virus challenge is provided on a frequent basis. It's more similar to the exposure that an infant that's breastfeeding would have. And these two have demonstrated that antibodies can be protective, both when the antibodies are given in advance of the exposure, and also in cases where the antibodies given within 30 hours after the inoculation, there has been demonstration of clearance of the virus from cells. So the NHP studies are very supportive, but those are monkeys. What about humans? Well, we now have human data that demonstrates that a bnAb product, specifically the AMP studies of VRC01 that were administered to adults with risk for HIV acquisition through sexual transmission, were found that the bnAb did protect against transmission against strains that were highly sensitive. And this study also suggested a potential surrogate marker, the PT80, which will be helpful in design of subsequent studies using bnAbs for prevention. That PT80 will still need to be validated for sexual transmission, and we don't know exactly how it will translate to perinatal breast milk exposure, but it is an excellent starting point. So there has been interest in using bnAbs for the prevention of perinatal HIV for quite a number of years, actually long before the AMP study was even conceived of. And we've made substantial progress in studying bnAbs in young infants. IMPACT P1112 is an open label dose escalating phase 1 safety and pharmacokinetic study of subcutaneous bnAbs in HIV exposed infants. And this study looked at 3 different antibodies. All of them were CD4 binding site antibodies, VRC01, VRC01LS, which has the LS mutation that confers a longer half-life, and VRC07, 523LS, that is both more potent and also a longer half-life. The study design enrolled infants that were exposed to HIV through birth or breastfeeding. They all received antiretroviral treatment for prophylaxis, and they also received a dose of the bnAb at birth. And if they were still breastfeeding at 12 weeks, they received a second dose of the bnAb. You can see here the different cohorts and doses that were evaluated, and these range from 20 milligrams up to 40 milligrams per kilo. And then in some of the later studies, we also used a weight-banded dose, which gave us a dose on average around 30 milligrams per kilo. And altogether, there were 83 infants that were enrolled in this study. So there were no issues with feasibility. There were high rates of receiving the second dose when indicated. No safety concerns were raised. There were mild to moderate local reactions, which were common, but they were short-lived. And the majority were resolved at 4 hours, and almost all of them had resolved by 24 hours. Beyond P1112, there are 2 ongoing studies that are looking at VRC01 and that would provide additional safety data. And these include IMPACT 2008, which gave 4 doses to infants aged 3 to 5 months who were living with HIV. These infants were living with HIV. And then P1115, which is giving a single dose at birth and then additional doses for those infants that have HIV. And together, these studies will provide an additional safety data on over 200 infants. The safety outcomes for IMPACT 2008 have been analyzed. And again, there were no significant safety concerns. There were very common local reactions, but none of these were severe, all mild and moderate and very short-lived. We have been able to learn a lot about bnAb pharmacokinetics from these studies. And this plot shows in the black the IV dose for adults at 20 milligrams per kilo. And then the red line is infants that received a subcutaneous dose of 20 milligrams per kilo. And the blue line is infants that received 40 milligrams per kilo. And things that are demonstrated here are that the high levels were achieved by 1 day after subcutaneous injection, which is important since you want to be able to have levels that are high quickly, but sub-Q will be much more feasible than IV administration for infants. The infant PK levels were very well predicted by the adult PK parameters. However, infant growth does contribute to the apparent clearance and needs to be taken into consideration in the dosing schedule and schema. Dr. Edmund Caporelli and his team have done modeling with VRC01 infant data to compare to PK in adults. And they've found that infants absorb the subcutaneous dose more rapidly than adults, 2.7 times higher, and also have a weight normalized clearance that's lower, 83% lower, which allows for a longer half-life. P1112 compared the pharmacokinetics of VRC01, and then it's the modified version with the LS mutation. And as was observed in adults, the clearance of VRC01 LS, that's the red line, was slower than VRC01. And so these long-acting bnAbs could potentially be given quite infrequently during the course of infancy. As an important point is that the PK parameters are stable over time, and repeated doses have no accumulation. And the parameters are similar at birth, and here we see the second dose at 3 months. And you can see that the slopes are very similar for the first dose as for the second dose. And that's an indication that there's not a lot of developmental changes in the metabolism of the bnAbs during this time, which is distinct from what we would expect for some of the small molecule antiretroviral drugs. And finally, this study also looked at VRC07 523LS, which is a more potent bnAb, and also demonstrated slower clearance here in the blue line versus the black line, which is VRC01. So what's next? There are several studies that are enrolling or in development looking at bnAbs, some of the newer generation ones. So as I mentioned, P1115 had been looking at VRC01. It will incorporate VRC07 523LS into its next version. Impact 2037 is a sort of a sequel to P1112, which will look at PGT 121414LS with or without VRC07 523LS. And a study that has gotten started in South Africa with a medical research center, the PEDMAB1 study, is looking at CAP 256V2LS with or without VRC01. There are also studies that are looking at feasibility and acceptability that are being done by IAVI and Impact, as well as looking at levels of bnAbs in the oral secretions for P1112. So one of the concerns that's often brought forward when we talk about using bnAbs for prevention in a resource-limited setting is a concern for the cost. And Caitlin Dougal's group has applied their modeling for cost effectiveness and found that across a wide range of both hypothetical cost and hypothetical efficacy estimates, the bnAbs are cost effective in several different settings in sub-Saharan Africa, including Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And in high incidence settings like South Africa, universal dosing of the bnAb, irrespective of HIV exposure, was cost effective based on their model. So to summarize, what are some key points or drivers that are supporting use of bnAbs for perinatal HIV transmission prevention? We anticipate, as we've seen so far, good safety and PK in infants. There's a defined period of exposure for infants, so we know exactly how long they need to have the bnAbs present. And this is an approach that actually might be feasible to use for women who have incident HIV. So just as we do immunizations for infants, not knowing for sure whether they'll be exposed or not, this potentially could be used for infants in the setting of whether a mother might be at risk for HIV, even though we don't know for sure whether she's living with HIV or not. The dose is small, and that reduces costs and avoids the requirement for IV administration. It's also long-acting, and therefore it can be discreet, and potentially can be integrated into the EPI vaccine schedule, which is an infrastructure that already is strong. And using bnAbs avoids the risk of resistance to other antiretrovirals that might be first-line treatment for if there was breakthrough infection. And finally, there is a large market, potentially up to 3.2 million children eligible in high incidence settings. So to close, I would like to thank the study teams that contributed to the data to this presentation, the P1112 and 2008 team and the CPAC team for the cost effectiveness data, our funders, the Vaccine Research Center, which has been a very enthusiastic partner in these studies, and finally the parents and the infants who participated. And I'll stop there and ask, are we ready to move forward with bnAbs for babies? And I think that's what we'll be discussing in the rest of this session. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's a pertinent question if we are ready. But thank you, Betsy, for all of the evidence that that has pointed us to why the bnAbs for prevention, especially in babies or infants, is a possibility. And those are very interesting value drivers on how this really can be possible. Now, we're going to have our last speaker. In fact, I'm going to introduce 3 people, and these people are not the panelists. But the next person who is going to speak is one of the people I'm going to introduce, and then I'm going to introduce someone that I should have introduced at the beginning, who is going to take over from here when we go into a panel discussion. And then the last person that I'm going to introduce is myself, because I don't remember introducing myself at the beginning. And my name is Ntando Yola. I am with the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and also an advocacy organization known as Advocates for Prevention of HIV in Africa, APA. And so let us, we're going to hear from Dr. Vincent Muturi Kioi, who is a senior medical director within IAVI's clinical development team and is responsible for the design of clinical development plans and clinical trials protocols for HIV vaccines and bnAbs products within IAVI's pipeline. And then once we hear from Vincent, we are going to be hearing from somebody who is going to take the discussion further and through a panel discussion, and that is Shelley Malhotra, who is the Executive Director of Global Access at IAVI and is based in the US. And Shelley is really the brains behind all of this work, at least from the IAVI perspective. So please let us welcome Vincent.
Thank you, Tando. Like those before me, I'd like to acknowledge the owners of the land and also to thank those who make our work possible. So my talk today is going to focus on giving feedback on the stakeholder consultation that we carried out in February of this year. Several groups had been in discussions, and this culminated in a stakeholder workshop convened by IAVI, the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation, and advocates for policy on HIV and APA. Yeah. And this brought together ethicists, members of the community, civil society, members of regulatory authorities from sub-Saharan Africa, program implementers, funders, researchers, and statisticians. I think we all agreed that the issues that resulted in continued high rates of vertical transmission across sub-Saharan Africa were structural, but also there were several issues that could be addressed by the development of new products. When thinking about broadly neutralizing antibodies, one of the questions was, based on experience with previous trials to test for the efficacy of interventions against vertical transmission, there is a challenge around design of efficacy studies. Generally, within the clinical trial setting, there's optimization of available interventions, and therefore difficulty in being able to actually demonstrate efficacy because you reduce the chance of seeing endpoints in the form of incident infections. And so we thought, how would we design a clinical development program and design efficacy trials to show that these interventions work? The second thing was, in the space of HIV prevention, we know that a lot of the focus is on development of interventions to prevent HIV transmission in adults, and most of that is focused on prevention of sexual transmission. What we see in the infant space is that we are still using nevirapine and zidovudine as the mainstay of biomedical prevention products that are applicable for use by the infants. We do believe that a long-acting product that's demonstrated to be safe and efficacious can offer increasing benefits that could aid in reduction of vertical transmission and especially in reduction of the rates of postnatal transmission of HIV, where we are seeing the gains not being as marked as we would hope. So this workshop was convened to refine and gain consensus around how we would actually do this. When is the appropriate time to start a development program for new interventions focused on prevention of vertical transmission? Which population would be enrolled? And how would we design the efficacy trials? So the first question that I'll focus on is, what evidence is required prior to starting a clinical development program for infants? Traditionally, we might expect to require that efficacy data from adults is present before then starting a pediatric investigational plan. But based on what we've discussed, we do feel that, especially for broadly neutralizing antibodies, there may be specific advantages to advancing these products to an infant indication in parallel to what is being done in adults, rather than waiting until we have efficacy data in adults. So the consensus from the group that met was, what we would require from adults is safety data from first-in-human trials, and then that would allow for the initiation of a pediatric investigational plan that would be initiated with demonstration of safety of individual broadly neutralizing antibodies and demonstration of their pharmacokinetics characteristics before they're used in combination. In addition to this, we all agreed that early engagement of the community around the design of these programs and around the types of the evidence that would be required to initiate this program would be important. Employing a good participatory practice approach to this engagement is key, with clear messaging needed that communicates the risk benefits that would justify the selection of the population that we would be working with. So on to the study design. Our expectation is that following demonstration of a positive safety profile of individual broadly neutralizing antibodies used alone and a favorable pharmacokinetics characteristic, there would be an opportunity to test them in combination for safety and pharmacokinetics as well. Once this is done, you would be able to select a dose combination and dose intervals for administration in an efficacy trial and allow us to proceed into efficacy testing. For the efficacy trial, the group had consensus on the fact that we do need to carry out an individually randomized control trial. And this was after consideration of several different designs, including cluster randomized trials and the possibility of using trials with an external control. For this individually randomized control trial, we would use an internal control, and we would power the study not only to evaluate the prevention efficacy of the bnAbs, but also to evaluate the neutralization surrogate that Betsy highlighted earlier. For the endpoints, postnatal infant HIV infections was seen as being a key endpoint to demonstrate efficacy, and the establishment of safety would be measured by injection site reactions as well as adverse events throughout the administration period. In addition to that, other factors related to child health, like infant growth and milestones, was highlighted as key. For the study setting, we took into account several considerations. Where is the greatest burden of disease? Where is the highest risk noted? There were questions of, should we focus only on HIV-exposed infants, or try and provide a study design that allows us to demonstrate protection even for those who may not be exposed at birth but are at risk during the breastfeeding period. The consensus was that for geographical areas with the highest rates of vertical transmission, it would be important to demonstrate efficacy in these settings to ensure they are the first beneficiaries following licensure. And for the infants to be selected, an approach where all infants living in a setting where there was a high rate of vertical transmission, especially during the postnatal period, was seen as being key. For the standard of care, we know that the standard of care for prevention of vertical transmission varies across countries. So the WHO have a recommendation around use of antiretroviral drugs for infants who are HIV exposed at birth. But the manner in which this is implemented varies quite markedly across countries. We agreed that the use of the standard of care in the study setting should match what is available in each individual country and follow the national recommendations there. So all study participants would receive the national standard of care, and then the participants would be randomized to either receive the bnAbs or a placebo in addition to the standard of care. Although we had consensus on a majority of these issues, there are still areas that are in need of further discussion. The types of combinations of broadly neutralizing antibodies to be used in the final product is an area that still needs further discussion. The basis of selection will be on the circulating viruses in different geographic regions and the coverage of these viruses by the available broadly neutralizing antibodies. So what might work in one region might not be universally applicable, and the question of when to proceed is still up for discussion. Also, the need to develop preclinical animal models that could support product development by demonstration of the dynamics and how virus diversity affects transmission was also seen as a key area of further investigation. So in summary, during this workshop, we gained consensus on the clinical development pathway, the approach to community engagement, the study setting that would be appropriate for efficacy trials, as well as the potential designs for a pivotal efficacy trial that would allow for licensure and access for those most in need in the shortest period of time. There are areas for further discussion, but we think that there is a possibility to have a program that's designed to provide these products to address the medical need that has been highlighted so far. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we're going to go into the panel discussion, and then after that, we're going to have Q&A with the audience, so everyone will be able to ask their questions. I wanted to start out first by introducing the remaining panelists who haven't yet been introduced, starting with Glenda Gray, who's familiar to many of us. Glenda is the president of the South African Medical Research Council and co-PI of the HIV Vaccines Trial Network. Her research focuses on HIV vaccines and interventions to prevent vertical transmission of HIV. So welcome, Glenda. Thank you for joining us. And next, I'd like to introduce Paul Ndebele, who is a bioethicist who currently serves as the Assistant Director in the Office of Research Excellence at the Milken Institute of Public Health at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Paul. And also on the phone, on Zoom, we have Priscilla Nyambayo. Priscilla is a clinical pharmacologist and head of the Pharmacovigilance and Clinical Trials unit at the Medical Control Authority of Zimbabwe. And all of our panelists, we were fortunate to have at the stakeholder consultation. And so, Vincent provided a very clear overview of some of the discussions that took place. And what we want to do here is to really kind of build on what he presented and tease out some of the key issues that were discussed, go deeper on key takeaways, share some perspectives on the different ethical, regulatory, clinical, and access considerations that emerged during the discussions, as well as areas of consensus on how we can accelerate the pathway. Okay, so with that, I'm going to dive in, and my first question is going to be for you, Glenda. Historically, and particularly in the case of HIV prevention, we've seen a failure to expeditiously advance studies in infants. When it comes to bnAbs, I guess I want to ask you, why do we have the imperative to do things differently?
Well, we have a lot of, we've just learned, we just heard today and also at a workshop yesterday run by the paediatric group of the high rates of vertical transmission that still continue. And I heard in this area, in this region, Asia and the South Pacific area, we have transmission rates as high as 40% in India. So there's lots of work to be done. So we see high rates of HIV transmission. We see areas in the world where women don't have access to HIV testing. They have to opt in, and they have to get access to their HIV testing in settings that aren't integrated into the antenatal service. So women largely are disadvantaged at a global level in their inability to get their HIV test at their setting where they receive antenatal care. The ability to get treatment and also to get regular testing in case they transmit during breastfeeding or in late pregnancy. So there's, at a global level, there's a market failure in trying to prevent mother-to-child transmission. And the administration of a universal subcutaneous monoclonal antibody vaccine at birth would solve these problems at a global level, and once and for all, put an end to breast milk transmission or transmission that occurs in late pregnancy. So I do believe that irrespective of whether there will be bnAbs for heterosexual or other sexual acquisition or intravenous drug use acquisition of HIV, we must dissociate from the adult market and focus on getting monoclonal antibodies for this indication. And so we have to separate these two pathways. Our question is clear. We have a target product profile, and we have infants that need to be attended to. It should be universal. We've heard about the market. The cohort 18 million, I think it's even more, in every child that's born on this planet every year should get a dose of a monoclonal antibody at birth to prevent breast milk transmission. And that's the only way we're going to eradicate pediatric HIV at a global level if we're serious about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Glenda. And Nelly, do you want to add anything from your side?
Thank you, Shelley.
Yes, I'd like to allude with what Glenda has alluded to. Also, with Vincent, he did indicate that for the longest time, there had seemed to be like a neglect when it comes to a response for children or infants. So I believe that the bnAbs can be used as a proactive and effective preventive tool to prevent vertical transmission. And early diagnosis is the key. And also, our interventions should not only focus on biomedicals only, but it should only also focus on the lobbying for the community engagement, also for the support of the bnAbs. We've seen how, the response with COVID-19 had an impact where mothers that were pregnant, those that were actually given vaccine, we've seen how effective the vaccine was, which was also babies that were born out of those mothers that were given the vaccine. We've seen how effective the bnAbs have been working. So I believe that with using the bnAbs, focusing on infant vertical transmission, it's a good start. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so one of the topics that came up at the Cape Town meetings was the target population for infant PMP studies. And Glenda, you kind of shared your perspective on this one, but maybe we can elaborate a bit. There was a recommendation from the group to focus on inclusion of all comers in high transmission areas, and that's different from the current approach, which initially focused on high-risk HIV-exposed infants and is broadening to HIV-exposed infants. But there was a strong recommendation from the group to focus on all comers in very high transmission areas. And I would love it if we could kind of share our perspectives from, Paul as an ethicist, Priscilla on the phone as a regulator. I'd like to hear from the researchers and then also from our civil society community counterparts. Maybe starting with you, Paul. Can you share your thoughts on your perspectives on this topic and the approach of taking all comers?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think NLA has actually provided a very, very rich background in terms of justifying why we need to include all kinds of women in this particular trial. From NLA's presentation, it was obvious that there are some women that are not even aware of their HIV status due to various reasons. From that presentation, it was also obvious that there are some who are taking antiretroviral therapy, but for one reason or another, they end up dropping off, and that becomes an issue. So for me, when I'm looking at the participants in this particular group, and when I'm looking at the breastfeeding persons or women, I'm actually firstly focusing on their HIV status. So I could actually lump them into two groups. We're looking at those with non-HIV status. So we are looking at those who are HIV positive and they are on treatment. So it actually means that for those ones, the chances of transmitting HIV to their babies is kind of reduced, but it's not at 0%. We're also looking at those who are HIV positive and not on treatment. That's the second category. We're also looking at those who are who are currently HIV negative. I want to emphasize on currently HIV negative, because at any other point, they might actually seroconvert. It might be today, it might be tomorrow. Once that happens, we are not even sure. And then we are looking at the second group. These are the women of a non-HIV status. So there are some who are currently HIV positive and they are not aware of their status because they haven't gone for testing due to one reason or the other. But we also have those who are currently HIV negative. They are not aware of their status. We are just assuming that they are currently negative. So by focusing on all these mothers, we're actually trying to come up with an option that serves all the 5 categories so that we do not exclude any babies from benefiting from this particular intervention, I want to emphasize that infants in all these 5 groups are actually at risk of HIV infection, and having this particular option within the toolbox would actually be an advantage for all. And in addition, we also want to ensure that we're not going to come up with an option that is going to be labeled as something for infants who are born to HIV-infected mothers. That actually affects acceptability of the options. So if we have an option that can actually be used by any baby born to any type of mother, that would actually be the best option. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, terrific. Priscilla, I would love to hear from you next in terms of, from the regulatory perspective.
Okay. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on which part of the world you are. So thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. So I would like to appreciate, I think, as a regulator, the efforts that has been done in developing this product. Just for the panel and the audience to know that for Zimbabwe, we have approved 10 clinical trials since 2010 of the bnAbs. So I believe a lot of work has been going on, and as regulators, we've been supportive of this initiative. So going forwards, I think from a regulatory perspective, it's really 3 questions that we need to answer. One, I think the safety is coming up nicely. The answers to the safety of the product or products. And the second question is the quality. So, and then so we look at the safety, the quality, and the effectiveness or efficacy. So those are the 3 questions that as regulators we would like to have some answers and some convincing answers for us to have the evidence. So that all these initiatives, all the clinical trials, all the good work that is going on, the community engagement and so forth, the ethical considerations and so forth, we come up with a very clear, what we will call investigation product development, the pathway, the drug development pathway. So I think if you can, we can all work in a way that we can answer those 3 questions from a drug development pathway. I think that would really fast track the whole process of making this initiative cost effective and hopefully reduce the mortality, improve the mortality, and also reduce the HIV infection rate in the infants. So for us, it's really the evidence, I think, that is critical.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Shelley. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe now from the research perspective, I don't know, Betsy or Glenda, if you want to chime in, or Vincent, why does it make sense, this clinical trial design, from kind of your researcher's perspective when it comes to Priscilla's last comment about making sure that we have the evidence we need to use the product, in the target populations? Betsy, maybe I'll call on you first.
Sure. So I think one of the biggest gaps that we have that we really don't have a way to address, even with the long-acting small molecule ARVs, are women that don't have HIV, but are potentially at risk of acquiring HIV. And bnAbs could be potentially a safe and universally available way to help to protect those infants without exposing mom to toxicity and only giving a product that's actually quite safe for the infant. So I think that's one of the compelling rationales for looking at a more global or universal application.
Do you want to add anything, Vincent or Glenda?
Sure. Besides what Betsy's saying, a universal application would make it more affordable, would drive down the cost of production if you go to large-scale production. It also would destigmatize an intervention, and also in places where women have to opt in for HIV testing, we would not be able to identify the infants that may be vulnerable to HIV transmission because the mom doesn't know her status or she seroconverts during breastfeeding. So a universal application would be the best way. And so if that's going to be who we're aiming to get to, we need to get into that population as quickly as possible. And we've seen the work the Impact has done, that's established the PK and the safety profile, which means we should be starting to think about how we get these products into infants in areas of the world where breast milk transmission is still a big problem, and in areas of the world where there is high rates of transmission because women are not accessing HIV testing, even though, like India, even though the prevalence, the HIV testing is not standard, women are often infected because, babies are often infected because their moms don't know their status. So I think it's important to try, not only in Africa, to evaluate these interventions, but also to look at other parts of the world where there are high rates of vertical transmission.
Great, thank you. And maybe would finish off this question with Ntando or Anele, if you want to share kind of from the community or civil society perspective.
Well, no, thank you, Shirley. I think I'll sort of emphasize the whole aspect of inclusion of all mothers, regardless of their HIV status, which is something that was even largely welcomed by mothers who were actually there, and actually some of the mothers are openly living with HIV. And one of the great opportunities that were felt this kind of inclusion would have is take away the stigma in the product. We know of the interventions that we currently have that, at the beginning of the rollout, they were very much attached to specific populations. And that has, if we talk about PrEP, that has really impacted the uptake and the adoption and acceptance of the intervention. So I think that's just one of the very strong messages that were very much welcomed. And another was on what Glenda has spoken about with regards to universal access. And in fact, a strong message came through that it's never too early to think about access and preparing for success on these products. If you might think, this is still, still looking at the concept, but that was a very strong message which comes with a lot of preparation, which also includes a very important aspect of the manufacturing of these products. And as part of the earlier remarks that it will be very important to have all of this manufacturing as part of the initiatives that are already existing, for instance, in South Africa, to have local manufacturing of the products. So I think those are some of the key messages or takeaways that came up, especially from communities.
Okay, so maybe building on that theme, I'll ask one more question before we open it up to the audience for questions. So if you're online, queue up your questions so we can turn to you in a minute. But, I'm glad we're talking about access. To have a public health impact, we're going to have a strategy for how we get these products to infants. And so I'd want to ask you to build on kind of what Ntando started speaking about. What are some of the key things that we need to be doing now, early in clinical development, to ensure that these products are eventually made available and widely available and affordable? Vincent, maybe I'll turn to you.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. I think when considering the approach to the clinical development, we've spoken about trying to ensure we can move very quickly from adults to infants with safety data on the available products and starting to define the profile of the combination product that would be applicable to infants. At the same time, being able to consider the manufacturing aspects, so how to make sure that you can have an affordable product that could be used. I think Betsy highlighted some of the engineering that's being done to improve the half-life of the product so you can use less of it. There are also efforts to engineer them to make them more potent so that you can use less of the bnAbs, and all this is driving towards being able to not only demonstrate that the products work, but have a product that would be affordable once the manufacturing has been done to allow for widespread distribution. And beyond that, all the work that's being done to define the market, to also define the cost effectiveness, and to define the implementation procedures that would be done within the public health programs in a way that would have the maximum impact at the most cost-effective price. I think all that is work that can be done right from the start of the clinical development process.
Glenda, you wanted to add to that?
We need to rapidly dissociate, if our target product profile are infants and babies, we need to rapidly dissociate ourselves from the adult market. And so we need a minimal, Betty showed us that the PK is different, and that the different PK levels. So we need very little data in adults. And maybe we need a small safety study for each monoclonal antibody, and we rapidly get to our target product, which is universal infant at birth population. And so I'd like to make a plea as the rapidity to get into infants, and not hedge our obsession with adults to establish safety and efficacy first. We probably need a small amount of adults before we go into newborns.
Great, thank you. Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, please walk up to the microphone and go ahead.
Hello. I think I'm loud enough. So I'm Mildred Obare. I'm a medical. Hello. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm Mildred Obare. I'm a medical doctor from Kenya. I just have a quick question on the science basis of bnAbs. So we understand that infants, it's a developing time for these infants, and their immunity is just developing. So looking at the potential benefits of broadly neutralizing antibodies, so how do we balance it in terms of the need to preserve the natural immunity and avoid the potential long-term effects of bnAbs in terms of looking at resistance or developing neutralizing antibodies against the bnAbs? Because we know even the duration that we're giving is around 6 months apart and all that, yeah. So thank you.
Does anyone want to take that one? Betsy, can you?
Yeah, so it's passive immunity, and so it's transient. The infants would be protected only for the period of time when the bnAbs were present. I don't think that it would, hopefully the infants don't have HIV, but if they do, at least the non-human primate models have suggested that having bnAbs on board early on may actually be beneficial in terms of the response to HIV that's developed in infants, infant macaques, at least after exposure when bnAbs were present. And there's actually is a very active interest in looking at whether we can combine the bnAbs with a active immunization. We still need to get the right active vaccines identified, but potentially these could be used together.
Great. Okay, next question.
Thank you. I'm Patience Atware, a medical doctor from Uganda. Been involved in a number of PMTCT trials. And my question is about the plan for the moms who are HIV negative and they don't anticipate, to have risk, is there any plan to actually convince them to accept this product? And during the consultative meetings, were there any moms that are not living with HIV, and what were their contributions? Thank you.
Glenda, anyone want to chime in on that one?
Melissa, do you want to talk about the experience in MRC?
In LA? Okay, Vincent, you're on the hot seat.
So I think the question here comes to individual choice. If a mom highlights that from her perspective, the risk is minimal or non-existent and therefore doesn't see the need for receiving the product, I think within the clinical trial setting, only those who are willing to participate would be invited to participate. I think that in such a setting, all moms in the communities where we are hoping to work would be informed about the potential benefits, and these would generally be areas where there's been a demonstrated high incidence and possibly a high incidence amongst new mothers during the period of breastfeeding. Beyond that, I think the question does come up once you've rolled it out and you're offering it alongside perhaps pediatric vaccines in the EPI schedule. Would there be an opportunity for moms to opt out? I think that that's something that would have to be discussed at the public health setting, where how do you approach a situation where a person is coming for a suite of services, including the API vaccines, and perhaps thinks, I'm not at risk and therefore my child should not receive that. And I think that's something worth discussing in the future, yeah.
Just to also add on that, as the community working group, it is our roles and responsibility to ensure, as Vincent has indicated, we do not compel mothers who do not want to participate, but it's also important for us as people who are part of the community working group to actually go out and reach out to the community, have public awareness education, to have that collective and reception and understanding from the community to say, what are the benefits of these bnAbs in the future, because we don't want to have a case where at a later stage the mother comes with the child that has already transmitted HIV whilst the opportunity was there. So it is us, it is our role and responsibility to ensure that we go out and translate this evidence into practice, where we are engaging with the mothers, we are doing consistent and continuous education at a community level. Thanks.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm Lisa Frankel from University of Washington and Seattle Children's Research Institute, and I have a two-part question for Dr. McFarland and Dr. Gray. If you are designing a cocktail of monoclonals for a regional area, say Kenya with A and D, subtypes A and D, or South Africa with C, how many monoclonals would you need, and would you have to give dosing so that you achieve a certain level of each of those at an effective concentration, and what would you think that dosing would be based on the AMP trial? So how many different monoclonals would have to be there, and at what dosage do you think? Are you there, or can you guess at this time?
So we've been having that discussion in the Medical Research Council with the program that we're doing with CAP 256 and the VRC07 LS combination, and looking at the kind of bottlenecks of transmission through breast milk. We believe that we probably don't need the triple cocktail that you may see that one is trying to attain for sexual acquisition. And so we're busy evaluating whether we need one or two, and whether we take two, whether we'll have broad enough coverage for a whole region. And so the studies are ongoing. Betsy showed you some of the data where one is evaluating one versus two, and so some of the PK data we will have soon, and some of the in vitro work is ongoing to establish the breadth and the potency, and whether we need, how many monoclonals do we need. Once we've established we don't know if we need the same PT80 as in adults, so that the one in 200. That we may not need such a high bar, and we'll have to establish that in the study. When we have our pediatric endpoints, we'll be able to back calculate what the PT80 is, and which will help us for the future registration of other monoclonals in the future. So, so these are preliminary studies which will give us a lot of proof of principle to move forward as we go ahead. Betty, I don't know if you want to talk about 1 versus 2 versus 3. Betty, you can also talk about that, because that did come up in the workshop. We believe that we would believe we may not need 3.
Yeah, I think there's some preliminary work that needs to happen before we can make those final decisions. One is a lot of the panels that have been used to establish what the potency is of the currently available bnAbs are based on viruses that have been isolated from adults with sexual transmission. And I think it's important that we go and gather a panel of transmitted founded viruses that have been acquired through perinatal and breast milk transmission, and really look and see what the current bnAbs, what their potency is for those viruses. And that's going to give us a better sense of what the coverage would be, assuming the PT80 that Linda mentioned is accurate, and whether or not 2 versus 3 would be needed.
Thank you.
May vary by geographical region, actually, depending on the diversity of the circulating viruses in that area.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. My name is Huub Gelderblom. I'm with the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. I have a question for the pediatricians on the panel. We're talking here about selection and cost effectiveness and yada yada. At the same time, RSV monoclonal antibodies are being approved in high-income countries, and there will be probably a universal rollout where all infants born in high-income countries will receive a shot of monoclonals. Do we have a double standard here? What is your take on that? Shouldn't we have sort of a universal approach?
Yeah, I do think we should have a universal approach, and that, and I think the more we use monoclonal antibodies in the infant space, the more people will become used to it, and there'll be more trust. So I do believe that it's my hope that if we ever find a successful monoclonal to prevent breast milk transmission, that it's rolled out in all the countries, and that we prevent market failure, for these infants. So I do believe that we should be looking for universal access at a global level, and not leaving any child behind. None of the 0 missing children for vaccination.
Actually, I think we can fit in one more question if you want to stand back up. Yeah.
My name is Polo Maineja. I'm from the Oram Institute based in South Africa. So with the discussion pointing to us that we need to really minimize time between adults and kids, right now the field is moving towards inducing these bnAbs in adult populations. So have you been, discussions regarding what type of trials do we really need to start moving towards that field of, germline targeting among kids? Another small question is regulatory. We have found that in most cases, when you do apply to the regulatory to approve a new drug, for example, they'll ask you whether the data from the global north has come forward first before they approve a trial. So that's something that we really need to look into, that we should actually start from where the issue is.
Okay, Priscilla, maybe we can start with a regulatory question. and I'm not sure if you were able to hear that question about, you know, do we start with the global north regulators, or do we have a different approach this time around? Priscilla, are you there?
Hello, yes, I'm there. So I think that's a very important question, and I think all the discussions that have been raised so far are quite important to the product development. So we have, in Zimbabwe, we have legislation that says there needs to be approval. If it's an investigational product, then there should be approval from the country of origin. So it looks like you're working with a cocktail of bnAbs. So the question is, what is the country of origin of those bnAbs? And hopefully they are all getting what we call investigational new drug approval from the country of origin. So traditionally, new medicines, new molecules, they are usually come up from Western countries, from high-income countries, and for the obvious reasons of resources in product development. So that is really maybe what the doctor who has just asked that question, we can answer him that way. Then the second one would then be to say, which I mentioned earlier on, when you are looking for the evidence for safety, quality, and effectiveness, do you have the approved product development pathway? What that means also is, do you have the approved, what we call the pivotal studies for the evidence of safety, the pivotal studies for the quality? So as you are developing the product, obviously there's a lot of work going on for safety studies, a lot of work going on for efficacy studies, a lot of work going on for quality studies. So scaling up as well, there's a lot of advocates to say we should have a global standard of care and all that. So that involves a lot of quality pharmaceutical development to then come up with the right products as you scale up. So there's a lot of work that requires to be done, and this is where that multidisciplinary approach, multi-global approach then becomes very relevant. And I'm not sure then where are we, because I think why we're having this conference is also to map the way forward. And I think that global engagement from a regulatory perspective, depending on the country of origin of the products, will be quite important. And also to then have a clear roadmap to say, whatever we're doing, is it going to be cost effective in us getting that information that we want to have the dossier for registration that proves the quality, the safety, and the effectiveness. I want to work with effectiveness, because with efficacy, I think it's going to be quite strong for these products. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Okay. Yes, and I'm getting the messages that I need to wrap up. So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there. But I did want to kind of stop to end the session with a call to action. I think we've made great progress, and that's kind of the key message. But it's not enough. So we have a strategy that we believe can work, but it's going to take a lot of effort to get it to the finish line, and a groundswell of support. It's going to take funders to commit. It's going to take manufacturers to step up. It's going to take communities to guide us. And so, a concerted effort is needed to make this a reality. And, on that front, for those interested in joining us on this journey, we're going to be kicking off a task force here at the conference to map out the game plan for advancing this agenda. Our first meeting is Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. It's going to be in the boardroom at the Riverside Hotel, South Bank. And we're also going to have virtual participation. So if anyone wants to join us to think about how we're going to tackle this, please come in person or virtually. If you need the virtual link, track down me or anyone who's here probably on the stage can help you out. And if there's anyone else out there who wants to join, please let us know. I wanted to finish also by thanking our speakers, by thanking the Global HIV Vaccine Enterprise, who co-sponsored this symposium with us, all those who joined the consultation, who really helped to frame out this thinking. And then also I want to say special thanks to USAID and PEPFAR, who've made all this work possible. So thank you all.